Hello everyone, you are watching Talk to OBN show. I am your host Addis Asafa. My guest today is Dr. Daniel Bekele, Ethiopian Human Rights Chief Commissioner. We are going to talk about the recent report of Amnesty International. Doctor, it's a privilege to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Addis.
Good. What is your overall reflection on the Amnesty International report?
Sure. And I should begin by saying Amnesty International is a reputable, credible international human rights organization which works in a lot of countries globally and has been doing some human rights monitoring, investigation, documentation, reporting of human rights concerns in Ethiopia for the past so many years. So Amnesty is not new to Ethiopia. I am aware that its recent report on Ethiopia has been a subject of controversy among political parties, media, and at least two of the regional governments in Ethiopia, and human rights advocates and human rights defenders as well. But I would say that being a credible international human rights organization, its findings should be taken seriously. It should be taken seriously by relevant government officers for further investigation. But having said that, I also acknowledge and recognize that no report is beyond legitimate criticism for its shortcomings, for its gaps. And I do acknowledge that some of the criticisms I have been hearing on Amnesty's report are totally legit. You know, there are legitimate criticisms that observers have identified on Amnesty report in terms of how it looked at the context, how it framed the issue, and how it probably failed to look the context in which the alleged human rights abuses happened. So in that sense, I do recognize the legitimate criticism against the report, but it's also important that we should focus on the core findings supported by evidence, and those should be the priority concern in terms of how we respond to human rights findings.
Good. What are the major gaps seen in the report?
I would say, in my view, I think the report appears to have failed to give a proper, adequate context to the human rights situation in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is definitely a country in the middle of a transition, coming out of many years of political repression and history of systemic human rights abuses and violations in the past. But Ethiopia is also at the same time at the beginning of an exciting chapter in a political process to make a transition to a democratic rule, to a new kind of governance based on respect for human rights. But such a transition is not free from challenge. It's understandably complicated by the history of political violations and abuses that have happened in the past, and the weakness of law enforcement institutions, and the culture, the political culture, and the capacity of law enforcement officials, and the complexity of the political problems in Ethiopia are factors that you cannot ignore when you look at human rights incidents or allegations of human rights abuses. So that's one big broader context that you need to adequately understand. And then there are contexts that you need to pay attention to at a local level as well, depending on what local area you're talking about. You know, whether you are investigating an alleged human rights violation in Amhara or Oromia or Benishangul or Somali region or any part of Ethiopia, context to the alleged human rights abuses or violations happen in that particular context. So I think, you know, To be fair to Amnesty, they gave a bit of a background to Ethiopia's current socio-political situation, but I have to say that probably that background is very scant, is not an adequate background of the socio-political complexity of the country. You can't capture that complexity in one-page background briefing. So it's very important that you give a proper context of the current political situation of the country, the transition nature of the current political context, as well as the complexity of human rights abuses in Ethiopia, whether from armed groups that are fighting the government, or the complexity of the human rights violation that emanate in the context of an intercommunal conflict. You cannot deny human rights abuses that happen in a context of a law enforcement operation, which has been the focus of Amnesty's report in this case, and it's important that we pay attention to human rights abuses by security forces, but at the same time, you need to put this in context to be fair and balanced in your assessment of the situation.
Okay, the report is being criticized by different bodies, as you've said a while ago, different medias and different political parties, as well as the government itself is not willing to accept the full report as it is. There is a kind of understatement or either overstatement. What is your rate in that context?
Like I said, I think it is important to take the findings supported by evidence very seriously. The report uncovers alleged killings, extrajudicial executions, displacement, destruction of property, and some of the incidents that are related in the report are quite shocking. So I think for all of us, including the concerned government officers, you cannot fail to take this seriously, particularly when these findings come from a credible international human rights organization. I think the first thing is to take these findings seriously, to be concerned about it, and to demonstrate the political will and commitment for a genuine, independent, impartial, full, comprehensive investigation of what has happened. So in that sense, I'm encouraged by the response from the Office of the Attorney General, expressing the commitment for an independent and comprehensive investigation. So that is a proper response, but like I said, I think, it is also right to acknowledge the criticism from human rights observers, analysts, academicians, political groups on how the Amnesty recent report failed to capture the context, and how it's been a little insensitive in terms of looking at the political context of Ethiopia's current transition. And that criticism, which is arguably a legitimate criticism, starts from even the cover page, So there is a political tone to that. So it's very important that international human rights organizations need to establish their fairness, neutrality and impartiality, not only in their rigorous fact findings, but on how you frame and present your findings as well. Otherwise, you risk to be sort of tone deaf to the political context. So in that sense, I totally acknowledge that there are legitimate criticisms and questions to be raised on how the report was framed and presented in a way that it failed to give a adequate context to the alleged human rights abuses.
Okay, what are those legitimate reasons?
Like I was saying, it is basically doing a full appraisal of the political context. That Ethiopia is a country in transition, that the current administration has demonstrated a quality of political will and commitment to break from its past record of human rights abuses. And this is evidenced by a number of positive measures the current administration has taken. But at the same time, it's a transition that's faced with complicated challenges, including a history of security forces operation not fully complying with international human rights standards, and in the context that the security forces are battling with armed groups, that the reality that the law enforcement operation possibly must have crossed its line and did harm to civilians, but that by no means is a systematic, deliberate policy of a government to harm citizens. If this is presented as a systematic policy of government against its own citizens, you fail to capture the context and the complexity of the problem. It's not like government is pursuing a policy of attacking its own citizens or people in the country. But it is appropriate to acknowledge that some violations and abuses happen in a context of a law enforcement operation. That is by no means to excuse the human rights violations, but it is about making a distinction between harm that results in civilians in a context of a security operation, as opposed to a systematic attack against a particular group. So I think it's very important to appraise Ethiopia's current human rights problem in this context, that it is a human rights crisis that emanates from the political crisis and the limitation of the security forces in a law enforcement operation.
Okay, good. Why Amnesty only focused on 2 regions while Ethiopia has 9 regions across the country? Does that mean there is no any violation in other regions as well?
No, I think it would be for Amnesty to respond why they were particularly interested on the human rights allegations in these 2 particular places in a particular period of time. I think it's very important that we keep in mind that this is not a full comprehensive report of Amnesty International on the overall human rights situation in Ethiopia. This is just an investigative research report on a very defined period of time, focused on a particular period of time and a particular place. And it seems to me that, at least from what I heard from some of the Amnesty descriptions and justification of how they have identified the concern around these areas, I think this emanates from their perception about the degree and the magnitude of the human rights concern in this area, which is apparently, from their perspective, did not get sufficient attention, at least at the time when they did start the investigation. But that is, again, like I said, that's another aspect of failing to capture the overall context in the country, because that's not the only place in Ethiopia where you have intercommunal conflict or the operation of armed groups. So I think it made Amnesty's report somewhat vulnerable for what social scientists might describe as a selective bias. So how you select the topics or the issues or the locations for your investigation should also be done in a way that's not perceived to be a deliberate selection which would be questioned for its impartiality, neutrality, and fairness. So in that sense, I think, it's not necessarily wrong that a particular human rights investigation can focus on a particular incident, but how you balance your choice of issues or location is by giving a proper context. If you give a proper context that this is a human rights abuse that's happening in a context of similar kinds of abuses in different parts of the country, including the human rights abuses that's also perpetrated by the armed groups and the casualties that has resulted on civilians, and and the killings that's also perpetrated by the armed groups, then that would contribute to the fairness, the impartiality, and the neutrality of your findings, analysis, and recommendation. Otherwise, I think you make yourself vulnerable for perceptions of selective bias.
Okay, good. On your January performance evaluation report, you've said non-state actors worsening human rights crisis in Ethiopia. Why Amnesty failed to mention such causes of human rights violation?
I think you're referring to probably a point I raised in a report I submitted to Parliament, but perhaps it's also a point I raised on different occasions. So I guess what I was trying to explain is how Ethiopia's current human rights situation is much more complicated than it used to be in the past, where the human rights violation was described as having a pattern of what is known as a horizontal violation, which refers to a situation where the majority of the human rights abuses or violations are committed by state and state actors, including security forces. That used to be the pattern of human rights abuses in Ethiopia's political past. But since the new political transition in Ethiopia, we have seen patterns of human rights abuses that happen not only in a horizontal line, but also in a vertical line, in a context of intercommunal violence, intercommunal conflict, in a context of violations and abuses that are perpetrated by armed groups, in a context of human rights abuses committed by security actors at a regional level, because the nature of the security structure in Ethiopia now is a combination of the federal security forces as well as security forces that are organized and operate at a regional level. So there are some abuses committed by some members of regional and federal security forces, whether at a federal or a regional level. But in my view, there is no pattern of human rights abuses that is perpetrated by whether regional or federal security forces as a matter of a policy. It's not like the security forces set out in a killing spree. But it is true that there are some members of whether federal or regional security forces that have acted in violation of their duties, in violation of their professional ethics, and in a context of a law enforcement operation. Lives have been lost, people have been displaced, property have been destroyed by actions and inactions from both sides. So I think that's one of the legit criticism that some people raise about Amnesty's reports, that it has somehow failed to capture that balance. And I do understand Amnesty's arguments that it has focused more on alleged violation by state actors, but in the interest of fairness, impartiality, and
the two regions, the Amhara and Oromia regions representatives, have said it's a completely wrong report. Was that, a correct stand?
Addis, like I said, I do understand the criticism on the report, but I don't think it is right to completely dismiss the findings of the report. In that sense, I am more encouraged by the response from the Office of the Attorney General in expressing the political will and commitment for a comprehensive investigation. And the response from the Amhara region and the Oromia region is not one of a complete denial of the alleged incidents, but it is one of criticizing the report for failing to document and report abuses perpetrated by other non-state actors and for failing to capture the political context and for what seemed to be the political implication of the report, which seemed to suggest that it was a deliberate policy of government targeted against a particular group. I think that's probably what incensed the regional political leadership to react the way it did. I do understand that, but I think it's also important to say that a wholesale denial of the findings is not the way to go. It is responsibility of the government to take any allegations of human rights violation that comes to your attention very seriously and demonstrate the commitment to get to the bottom of it. Ultimately, the main concern for government should be whether or not the alleged incidents have happened, and given that this is coming from a credible institution, to do a thorough, comprehensive, impartial, independent investigation and hold perpetrators to account. And that's how Ethiopia's current administration can separate itself from the past political line of the government where the line has simply been denying all the allegations and dismissing all the findings and attacking the institutions as politically motivated institutions, preparing a politically motivated report. So I would like to see Ethiopia's new administration taking a departure from that kind of response.
Do you think the report was made with thorough investigation by balancing both the governments and the victims' thoughts equally? Why I say this is because I have seen so many attribution quoted from the victim's side, but there is no any opinion taken from government stakeholders. For example, you as a commissioner of human rights, the federal attorney general, federal police commission, or a peace minister. There is no any citation taken from these texts.
I think in terms of how Amnesty and other reputable international human rights organizations conduct fact-finding, in terms of how they conduct human rights monitoring, I have confidence that they really follow a rigorous fact-finding and investigative work, which relies on a methodology which is time-tested and tested in different political contexts in different countries, including Ethiopia. So I think, at least in that sense, we should have confidence on the degree of the serious nature of the work in terms of gathering evidences, facts, conducting interviews, and triangulating the sources of information and trying to get to the bottom of the situation to get as close to the facts as possible. I think these are reputable organizations with reputable professionals who take their job seriously and are motivated by promotion and protection of human rights. So I do give credit and credence to the rigorous nature of their methodology, their careful approach, and gathering facts and evidences. And in terms of response to their findings, I do understand that they reached out to government and different branches of government and different offices, both at the federal government and at the regional government. I do understand that at least one government office has responded to their queries, but perhaps not all the government offices responded to their queries and a request for more information and elaboration probably as they should. I do understand that perhaps the time Amnesty allowed for a response is rather very limited. You know, Amnesty itself takes quite a long time to do its own investigation. So you should allow an equally sufficient amount of time for government to respond to your queries. So perhaps the time may have been not very convenient, as Ethiopian government officials are also predominantly occupied with the COVID response, and probably they have not had a chance to properly find out what has exactly transpired in the particular locations and be able to submit their response or information from their side. But I do understand that at least Amnesty has reached out to seek response or clarification or information from the government side.
Okay, particularly your stake, your commission. To talk about your commission, have you ever, conducted any investigative research on those areas, particularly the Oromia and Amhara region?
Unfortunately, not yet. The Human Rights Commission, like Ethiopia, is in the middle of transition. I have only started this role a few months back, and we are in the process of a major reform and restructuring and capacity building with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission to make it fit for purpose, because in its current shape it's not really fit for purpose to be able to undertake such kind of investigative work. So we've not been able to do such kind of investigation to the extent that Amnesty did it. But that does not mean that we are not paying attention to the human rights concerns and issues, and we have very limited capacity.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Thank you for your
You're
time.
welcome.
Okay. You've been watching Talk to OBN show. Thank you for watching.